Hey everyone, welcome to week 7's lecture video in which we're talking about juvenile justice policy and reform. So this quote comes directly from our textbook and I want to emphasize it here. So in recent years, both nationally and internationally, there's been a significant shift towards reducing youth incarceration rates. So what this quote is saying, obviously, is that there has been a shift towards reducing youth incarceration rates. So we're trying to put fewer and fewer kids away in some kind of juvenile, not probation, juvenile holding, some kind of avoiding the facilities and trying to do alternatives to that. And so specifically, the reason why is that in recent years, we're talking the last 20 years. In the last 20 years, there's been growing evidence that traditional detention methods often do not effectively address the root cause of delinquency and actually may lead to worse outcomes. We've found that because incarceration or juvenile detention, what it does is it punishes behavior. It's not actually addressing the root causes. What we've talked about already in this class and in other parts is that delinquency and criminal behavior is not, some kind of mysterious static thing that happens. It's motivated. There is motivation behind it. There's logic behind it. There's something that's led to this moment. And simply locking up somebody does not solve the problem. We have to look for the root causes if we want to actually be rehabilitative. So that's why we're starting to discover that, hey, this is kind of not okay. And when we know that we're not actually helping, it can lead to, in some cases, if you remember, we talk about the continuity of crime. Well, we also talk about the issue of repeated offenses. And we talk about the issue of lifelong offenders. If we're not addressing the problem and we're only punishing, that's not necessarily going to work for everyone, and that's going to lead to more crime as adults. So, with that being said, this understanding, this research, this conversation has led to the development of alternatives. And I know I said that as like a weird surprise thing, and it isn't a surprise. We know this already. We know that there are alternatives to traditional incarceration. There have been for years, not just in juvenile, but in the adult system as well. And so what we know is that because we have this research, because we know that traditional incarceration doesn't work, now we're trying to do alternatives. Now we're trying to focus more on those things that aren't traditional incarceration. I will also say that within the incarceration itself, we're trying to change up how we do it as well. So one of the first ones that has been around for quite a while and has been, argued for well more than 20 years, I'd say probably about 40 years, has been community-based rehabilitation. So we've kind of talked about this before, but community-based rehabilitative alternatives are things that are done by the community in the community. They're not things necessarily run by the state. They might be run by the state, they might be supported by the state, but the idea is that they're not isolating individuals, they're helping them become part of that community again. We do know the negative impacts of incarceration are things like disruption of education trajectory and exacerbation of existing mental health conditions. So we know this is part of the reason why we want to make sure that we're doing alternatives. That's why I said, even in our own inside the incarceration facilities, inside these juvenile detention centers, we are trying to keep education on track. We are trying to provide mental health services because we know typical incarceration tends to lack in those areas. So one thing we do know, our textbook tells us this, is that Sweden and Germany have been focusing more on education, rehabilitation, and social integration for quite a while now, and they actually have lower recidivism rates since they've switched their focus. So this is where we say, it's not, if we go back to evidence-based practice, it's not just someone saying, yeah, we need to do this. No, this is, two countries have shown that this works. Now, take it or leave it. Sweden is one of those countries that's always being talked about for their cost of living, their country happiness, things like that. If you want to be like they're an outlier, that's fine. But Germany itself, Germany is an interesting case, and I think it helps prove this point that it does work. Is because Germany, for the most part, had a very similar design as the UK and as America as far as juvenile justice was concerned. So switching gears to something more rehabilitative has proven to work there, means it could work here as well. So one thing I do want to say is that while we do have alternatives, the other thing is that in the United States we actually did pass a bill, a act. It's the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act of 1974. What it does is this actually acts as kind of the blueprint for making changes federally for juvenile justice. In 1974, it was put in place and set up a lot of the basic things that we already had rulings on, things like, juvenile rights, things like that, but they put it into a codified piece of law so that now, if there needs to be something, we have a place where we can look directly to understand about juvenile justice. And like I said, the idea was that we're trying to develop alternatives, and why I mentioned the last 20 years, because the last update to the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act was in 2018. And so it is still being updated. There's still new stuff happening. But around the 2018 time was when there was a bigger focus on alternatives to punishment and looking at more rehabilitative things. So I want to emphasize, like, that's actually a component of that and why I mention it here. So we know we need alternatives, so we now have a law in place that lets us slowly make changes. So I want to say there's a couple things that we need to say about juvenile justice that are related to the previous thing, and that's, in general, studies show juveniles who participate in community-based programs have lower recidivism rates. When we have the individuals being involved with the community and they are participating in community-based programs, the recidivism rate goes down. Additionally, these programs often are less costly than traditional detention. And this is one of those things where I'm trying to think how I want to phrase this specifically. Some people get really passionate and people get really passionate about incarceration of individuals who have committed a crime. Whether they're juvenile or adults, there's always arguments and discussions about how somebody should be punished. This includes the death penalty as well as being locked up. And the reality is, and I want to mention this, in this sense right here, community-based programs are significantly less cost intensive than traditional detention. Juvenile detention facilities cost a lot to run. Community-based programs end up working with a lot of volunteer work and things like that, so there's saving of, budgets for employees and whatnot. So there tends to be less cost in a community-based program. I also would like to mention briefly here, this is not directly related to juvenile justice, but is related to the larger criminal justice system as a whole, and how we know that certain programs cost less and things like that. The cost of life in prison for a prisoner versus execution is significantly lower. So execution actually costs more than to keep somebody in prison for life. So it's one of those, we do know by the numbers, financially speaking, there are cheaper, effective methods across the board. And if we are trying to be financially conscious, then yeah, we should be looking more on the cost effective ways. So we should be looking at more of those community based alternatives than traditional incarceration for our juvenile offenders. And we do know, I want to point out real quick about programs, the success of programs depend on proper implementation. And I cannot emphasize this enough. Success in any program, educational, athletic, physical, mental, whatever, if you want a program to work, it has to be properly implemented. No shortcuts, no cutting corners. It has to be done properly. And I know this, I'm preaching to the choir. I would assume that most people would understand that, yeah, if you want to do something right, you do it completely. But that's not always the case. So I mentioned that here and I reference this. And with this, another quote that I really like, and it's important to note, is education and advocacy are critical in changing public perceptions and promoting an understanding of the benefits of these alternative approaches. I've said it so many times in my personal life as well as in my professional life. Education and advocacy are critical in changing public perceptions. Full stop. Right there. Whether it be political, religious, personal, ethical, whatever. If you want somebody to understand, you need to educate and you need to advocate. That's the truth. If you want to change the way the system works, you need to change the public perception. If you want people to give incarcerated individuals a second chance, you need to convince the general public that they deserve a second chance. If you want to convince a community that a child who has committed several crimes is worthy of saving and adjusting is a weird word, saving and rehabilitating, then you need to convince the public that that's true. Full stop. It's just how it works. All right, so I do want to talk a little bit about racial and gender disparities. So real quick, anybody who's had Race, Crime, and Justice, most of this is familiar and, doesn't really need to be highlighted too much, but I do want to at least mention it here. So if you've had Race, Crime, and Justice, you're already familiar with racial disparities, and we'll talk briefly about gender disparities. But those of you who haven't, this is a short mini version of an entire class. So we do know, historically speaking, from our arrest data, from a bunch of different sources of information that we have from official FBI, policing, all that type of information, we know that traditionally children with dark skin tones, this traditionally in the United States tends to be children who are identified as Black, Latin, or Native American. These groups are often engaged with the criminal justice system nearly twice the rate of white children. And so I want to emphasize, with dark skin tones, it's not exclusively Black, Latin, and Native American. It definitely can be Middle Eastern. It can be Indian. It can be anything that has a darker skin tone. Heck, even people who are classified as quote-unquote white but have dark skin tone, they tend to be engaged in the system at twice the rate of a light-skinned white child. And this is an unfortunate reality. It has to do with a lot of different factors. This is why I said those of you who've taken Race, Crime, and Justice, you should already be familiar with this, but those of you who aren't, the criminal justice system here in America has a long history of racial prejudice and undertones that's baked into, unfortunately, the development of the country as a whole. One of the biggest things that we deal with as a whole, as a people, is personal prejudice and bias. It's something that everybody has. Not everybody engages with it in the same way. Not everybody has the same exact prejudice, but biases are something that are inherent. And because of that, certain people who have a bias towards people of color tend to flock towards the position of policing. It's an unfortunate reality. And so we have those types of situations that cause more tension within the larger concept of policing. I'm trying to be very cautious with the way I say it. I don't want to come off as saying all cops are bad, but there is an unfortunate appeal of policing that appeals to individuals who have a predisposition towards power imbalances and things like that. But that's getting into a whole different psychology of this. I just want to briefly say that, yes, we do know, racially speaking, if you have a darker skin tone and you are a juvenile, especially a male, you are more likely to be incarcerated. You are more likely to be fined and in trouble for an act that a white child could do and get off, which is unfortunate. As for gender, this is something that I think we've talked about briefly, but female offenders traditionally get treated differently by male officers, often also depending on the type of crime. So if it's a minor crime, it's oftentimes that a female offender will often get off with that crime. If it's a more violent crime, depending on the circumstances of the violence and who it was geared towards and things of that nature, it might also change who gets what charges may or may not stick. We also know that specifically with female offenders, while they are more frequently arrested for less serious offenses, their influence towards delinquency tends to be things like sexual assault and mental health issues. And those things aren't adequately managed within the system. So there is a whole host of problems with the gender disparity. Like I said, the racial disparity has to do with darkness of the skin tone, but the moment you have a dark-skinned male committing a semi-violent crime, it is more than likely that they're going to be incarcerated, and more so at a harsher sentence than a white child would. Okay. Going back to that gender thing for a second, we talked about the chivalry hypothesis before. Reminder that the chivalry hypothesis is the idea that a male officer will view a female offender as a weaker individual who needs protecting and will therefore act as a quote-unquote guardian and will be more lenient with them. That's the chivalry hypothesis. So, to combat this, both the chivalry hypothesis and the racial disparities that we see, there's been a push made in juvenile justice and all policing for that matter, but we see it more specifically in the juvenile, is towards implicit bias training. And as I said before, everybody has a bias. It's unfortunate. It's a part of reality. It's not unfortunate, but it's a reality thing. We all have a bias. Through our life experiences, through the people we've met, we all have a bias. The problem is when that bias influences our behavior. And as I've already mentioned, we do see a certain group of people who go into policing. So by going into implicit bias training, which helps identify the implicit bias so that you can therefore avoid falling into the trap of the implicit bias, that's the goal of implicit bias training. To understand when it's your own personal issues and not actually something that is legitimate, and then, avoid any kind of violent or dangerous incident. So, I want to talk about mental health here for a second because several studies have indicated that up to 70% of youth in the justice system meet the criteria for at least one mental health condition, many suffering from depression, anxiety, and PTSD. So if we're talking about innovations, we know, number one, I guess I did a bad job of transitioning this. We see that because we understand this, we've made a movement towards change with the implicit bias training. With knowing that about 70% of all youth in the justice system suffer from serious mental health issues, we need to start focusing on that a little bit more. And so, very straightforward, many detention centers, they lack the resources and personnel to appropriately screen, assess, and treat the youth. Hear me when I say that again. Many detention centers lack the resources and personnel to appropriately screen, assess, and treat the youth. They might have one, they might have two, but they oftentimes don't have all three in a well-developed way. They might have all three in a less than well-developed way. The reality here is a lot of the traditional detention doesn't have the resources to do this. And so, unfortunately, mental health is not getting addressed in these facilities. And in general, I do want to mention that in general, there is disconnect between mental health services and the justice system. And that's partly because people don't understand how mental health issues work and influence behavior. We talked about, when we talked about, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. I don't know why my brain forgot it for a second, but if you remember when we talked about cognitive behavioral therapy, we said that we know that thoughts influence actions. Actions are our behaviors. So a lot of times the general public does not understand that mental health issues can influence an individual's behavior. And so we understand, those of us who understand that know that that's something that needs to be addressed. And so we need to work better at educating and informing people of how certain mental health responses can be problematic and lead to criminal behavior. Okay, yeah, I don't have it on the next slide. I do want to mention that we do know, in general, that some common behaviors of mental health are avoidance, can be aggression, acting out. If it's a juvenile who's dealing with it, they might be antisocial. They might be, staying out late past curfew, which is illegal, and you see where the problem comes. So one thing I do want to say is anybody who's had to deal with telehealth, with seeing a therapist via some kind of video chat platform, believe it or not, this is a way that we can make mental health better managed in the justice system, is by having telehealth, allowing mental health professionals to speak to individuals who are incarcerated. That's something that we actually can do now, which is pretty amazing. So, we've talked a bit about different types of behavior and not behavior. We've talked about different issues and whatnot. So, one of the chapters, literally chapter 7.2, talks about evidence-based policy. And it has this nice little fancy 6 steps of how to create evidence-based policy. And these are: identify the problem, conduct research, draft proposals, final approval, implementation, and continuous monitoring. Most of this is stuff that we've already talked about before. But I do want to emphasize a couple pieces of this for our own clarity. And first is identify the problem. Something that we haven't really talked about before, but is an important component of all this, is when we do identify a problem, we want to make sure that we are interviewing frontline workers. And if you're thinking to yourself, what do you mean a frontline worker? Well, a frontline worker is anybody who deals with the individuals on a daily basis who are seeing things front and center. So, for example, if you are trying to create an evidence-based policy to address some kind of behavior in a school, the frontline employees or the frontline workers that you want to talk to would be the teachers, would be the cafeteria employees. It would be people who are actively seeing the behavior themselves. If you want to implement an evidence-based policy in a juvenile detention center, you want to make sure that the people who are, identifying what the problems are people from the detention center. This is what I mean by a frontline worker. Not that it's made by some bureaucrat, not that it's made by some individual who doesn't have experience. You want to interview individuals who have first-hand experience. The second is conducting research, which is looking at previous research, other programs, looking at the unique issues of the particular problem that you are trying to create a policy for. And when you draft the proposal, the stakeholders should provide input. And I can't emphasize that enough. Stakeholders, much like the frontline workers, you want people who are going to be directly impacted by this to have a say. The rest of the process is pretty straightforward. Final approval is where it gets, actually government passed and everything like that. Implementation is making it happen in the facilities. And then continuous monitoring is something we've talked about before in this class. A policy or a program is not good if it just is one time and done. You want to make sure that you are watching it closely, and if something changes, if a new variable comes up, if something needs addressed in a different way, you want to be able to make those changes. Because if it stays the same for too long and it's not working anymore, why is it still running? So that's continuous monitoring. So, one of my favorite things to say throughout this class and through most of the classes is the most common and significant barrier to implementing evidence-based policies is the lack of adequate funding. I cannot say this enough. We've talked about before how poverty is a strong influence and motivator on criminal behavior, but lack of funding, the lack of money, which is the same as poverty, except now we're not talking about an individual person, we're talking about a policy or a program. Lack of money is the issue. A lot of time, evidence-based programs and practices and policies require training, require personnel, it requires things that need money. And unfortunately, getting people to agree to pay for it is not easy. And if you're doing it from a state or local situation and you want the public to partially pay for it, that means you have to do taxes. And then you have to convince the people that the taxes are good. And it becomes a mess. Budget is the biggest issue. Money is always the problem. It's the first problem in most cases. I do want to mention there are other common barriers, and I did list the 3 other most common ones, but lack of funding, that's the first one, that's the big one. The other 3 are things like resistance to change, lack of support from management, or the requirement of specific training. So resistance to change is both from the people within and from the general community. If people are unwilling to try something new, no matter what you do, it's not going to work. A policy only works if people are on board with trying it. A lack of support from management is much like resistance to change, except this time, some people are willing to do it, but the people in power are unwilling. If the people in power are unwilling to promote and push a new policy, it's not going to get properly implemented and it's not going to work. And then last but certainly not least, mentioned connected to the funding is specific training. A lot of programs and a lot of new policies require training. They require learning new ways, learning new systems, might be continued education, and that's something that not everybody wants to do. And sometimes it's something that, again, costs money that's just not available for the long term. And so there is this issue that specific training can sometimes be a barrier to actually successfully implementing an evidence-based policy. All right, so here I want to talk about another alternative that has been around for a bit, but gets more attention nowadays, and that's restorative justice. And restorative justice approaches are methods that emphasize healing, accountability, and reconciliation. And the literal definition from our text is an approach to justice that focuses on the needs of the victims and the offenders, as well as the involved community, rather than satisfying abstract legal principles or punishing the offender. What's important to note about restorative justice is that the focus is on healing. That's the big thing. Think restore, heal. So restorative justice is about healing. And what this actually looks like is trying to rebuild the connections that were damaged by the offender. So this is with the victim, for sure. You want to make sure that you can do victim mediation, which we're going to talk about victim offender mediation here in 1 second, which is the most common method. But we want to make sure that victims are being addressed, the general community is being addressed, and that the offender is taking responsibility for their actions and trying to make a legitimate attempt at reconciliation. They're trying to do a legitimate apology, not just I'm sorry, no, a real, authentic show of apology and regret. And so victim offender mediation, being one of the most common methods, is exactly what it sounds like, where you have a mediator and a neutral third party who sits and oversees a conversation, which essentially acts like a therapy session between the victim of the crime and the one who did the crime, the offender. And the idea is that it offers a space for healing and discussion where the victim can share how that crime affected them, and the offender can explain why they committed it. And the goal is that through discussion and seeing the impact that they had, the offender will realize the seriousness of their behavior and make amends. And through seeing the offender not as a monster or as an unknowable or thing like that, the victim can see them as a person and move towards forgiveness. And so that's really what victim offender mediation is. It's trying to reconcile both sides. The idea is, not to just blame the offender and make them feel bad. It's meant to be a healing opportunity for both parties and for true amends to be made. And I know some people are like, well, that's terrible or that's stupid. And I understand where that comes from. And I want to mention that victim offender mediation does not work in every situation. Not all crimes will work well with this. I can think of a handful of crimes that should not have victim offender mediation. Straightforward there. But the reality is, and I know this is one of the hardest things for a lot of people to consider, but a person who's committed a crime is still a person. They still have rights. They're still human beings. There's still a whole bunch of crap that you have to deal with. And that's what victim offender mediation is trying to do. It's trying to build that bond back. The other common thing that we see is things like healing circles. And healing circles are exactly what they sound like. They're essentially group therapy sessions where people who have been hurt and who have hurt others get together and talk through emotions and issues and motivations and work towards healing what has been broken. The big difference between a healing circle and a victim offender mediation is that the healing circle could include community members. Victim offender mediation often is just between those groups, the victim and the offender, not the general community. But a healing circle very well could. So, I do want to say that any restorative justice approach, its success depends on several things. It really does depend on the willingness of the victim to participate. If a victim is unwilling to participate in any type of restorative justice, that system itself won't actually work. Because it's important for the victim to not only work through it, but for the offender to be able to face the victim and properly apologize in a legitimate way. Success also depends on the offender acknowledging their guilt. The offender has to be willing to say that they screwed up, that it was their fault. Not, oh, somebody else is the reason why. No, it's taking accountability. That's an important step for restorative justice. If that doesn't happen, then it's not going to work. And last but not least, and we've kind of already talked about it in another sense, but the community's support for the process is necessary. If the community doesn't want to give that offender a second chance, restorative justice won't work. If they want to see healing actually happen, then yeah, it could work. So, there are some fundamental principles of restorative justice, and they're broken down pretty easy into ERIC, EARIC, encounter, amends, reintegration, inclusion, and collaboration. And so what this actually means, so encounter literally is where we want to create opportunities for individuals to meet and discuss. And this is coming back to that victim offender mediation. We want to create the opportunity for those two groups to be able to meet somewhere neutrally and discuss how they feel, what has happened. Amends is pretty straightforward. We expect offenders to take steps to repair harm. That's an important aspect of this. It's not the victim or the community's job to make the offender apologize. The offender has to want to make those pathways towards repairing harm. When we talk about reintegration, we want to seek to restore victims and offenders to wholly functioning members of society. And that should be a real big piece right there. Reintegration is not just about the offender, it's about the victim as well. We want the goal of restorative justice is for both parties to not be suffering and to not be incomplete members of society. We want them to be whole. That's why it's restorative. We want to reintegrate both parties in. Inclusion means providing opportunities for stakeholders to participate. That's the community being involved. And collaboration is working together to find solutions. And I really want to emphasize that piece in particular. We want people to work together. Collaboration is a powerful and important tool, and we don't really talk about it that much. So I want to mention that here. So let's adjust now. Let's talk about technology. And we're going to talk a little bit more about technology next week too. But so we talk about innovations in juvenile justice. So let's talk about some technology. We have GPS tracking and electronic monitoring. And that allows real-time tracking and geofencing. And I want to mention that this is a less restrictive and more cost-effective alternative to incarceration. think traditional house arrest where you have an ankle monitor that monitors where you are through GPS at all times, that kind of thing. That's what we're talking about here. And so I do pose a question in the quiz for all of you because it's an interesting question. Is it ethically right to GPS track a teenager? And I want to emphasize there's not a right answer to this. There really isn't. Because, number one, depending on your parenting style or your personal beliefs, you might view it very differently. Some people have strong feelings about privacy and are recent enough from being teenagers to remember what it was like and say, yeah, this is not okay. There's not a right answer to this. Because the reminder is GPS tracking and monitoring is a less restrictive alternative to incarceration and does have less of a negative impact than traditional incarceration has on juveniles. However, I do want to mention this, okay? There is evidence that there's a long-term effect of constant surveillance on teenagers that negatively impacts their mental health. We do not have full deep studies yet, but we do have a general understanding that there are some long-term effects of that. Okay? So, just consider that about the GPS tracking and electronic monitoring. So, another thing that actually is really kind of cool and scary at the same time is virtual reality. So, VR simulates real-world environments and social situations, providing a controlled setting to practice and learn. And that's actually something that's really cool that I even learned about fairly recently here in juvenile justice. And that is being able to use virtual reality to put juvenile offenders in situations that they would find themselves in the real world and teaching how to properly handle those situations is pretty powerful. It's a controlled environment where, nobody's actually going to get hurt or anything like that, but you can also modify and make it, work towards what you're trying to do. And so that's actually really cool. I really support this idea. And we do have a quote from the text that I really like. By making learning more interactive and engaging, VR has the potential to rekindle a love for education and inspire a commitment to personal growth. And I think this really hits at something that I don't think we talk about enough in general, but I think this applies to outside of juvenile justice, and that is learning should be interactive and engaging across the board in all areas. And that's something that is severely lacking. And heck, even in this class, in an online setting, I feel bad that it's not as interactive as it could be. And part of that is my own limitations of not knowing how to make it more interactive, as well as struggling to find ways to make it interactive. But this is something that I truly believe is learning should be more interactive and engaging. So I also have another question, but I'll ask that here in a little bit. So we also have, with technology, we have a separate thing of technology, which is data analytics and risk assessment. And so data analytics and risk assessment really are ways of looking at information and making assumptions. So we have predictive analytics, which is the use of advanced algorithms or formulas to analyze large sources or amounts of data to predict future behaviors or outcomes based on historical patterns. The idea behind predictive analytics is essentially looking at a bunch of arrest records and data and a bunch of crime reports and things like that and say, oh, okay, based off of these things that we've seen over the last 50 years, it is likely that these behaviors and these actions indicate that this behavior is going to result in this crime. That's what that's really trying to do. And so there are some concerns with predictive analytics. One thing in particular is bias. So we know in regards to bias is that if historical data that's used to train the predictive models includes biases, racial, gender, etc., they can be perpetuated and amplified by the models. Because we know historical data has high minority rates, and the model will include those minority status as a key factor that predicts criminal behavior. This is something we know. The fact that we already have discussed that there is a disproportionate number of dark-skinned individuals involved in the system means that predictive analytics will go, oh, this individual is more likely to be delinquent because they have a darker skin tone. It's something that's caked into the data that's kind of hard to separate. So that's a major concern with bias, is that it's going to be perpetuated, and it kind of does. The concern about transparency is that the complex nature of the algorithm's design and the fact that it's a competitive market to make and sell those means that training and inner machinations are unknown to pretty much everyone except for the developer or creator of the program itself. So sometimes people that use these predictive analytic softwares might not know actually how it works. It's one of those everything's magic until you break it apart and you learn how it works. And then some things still are. And then a concern about accuracy is that the data used should be ongoing, high quality, varied, and complete. But at the same time, it has to have historic data. It can't always be collecting new data. So there is an issue with that. But the other issue is no algorithm can accurately factor the dynamic nature of humans. In other words, no computer can accurately predict the chaotic nature of a human. This is where I say one of my favorite things in the entire world. Human beings are chaotic. We are different. We are, for the most part, put together, but we have lots of different thoughts. We have different opinions, feelings. We move from one thing to the other. And the reality is, no one can perfectly predict what somebody is going to do. You can make an assumption based off of their behaviors, but a person that does the same thing every day for 20 years could decide one day to change it up. They often won't, but they can. That's the chaotic nature of humans. We'll do something the same way 40 times, and then on 41, we decide to do something different. It's just the way we are. And a computer can't figure that out. That's the reality. All right. So, in general, not just related to predictive analytics, but I want to mention there are general concerns of technology reliance and use in juvenile justice and criminal justice. Some of these are also universally accepted, so they're things outside of this realm, but it is important to note that we are talking from the viewpoint of the justice system. So one of the first issues is of privacy. We don't know, who has access to the data. We don't always know what data is being accessed and what data is being collected. So there is general issues of privacy. But we also have a dehumanizing aspect, which is something that I don't think a lot of us think about. But when we overuse and rely on technology, there's not a human on the other end of that technology if we're relying on an algorithm or a software to do it. We take the human nature out of it. We take out that each case is unique that we talked about as one of the tenets of juvenile justice. Each case is unique, but if you rely on a computer program to do it, it's not looking at each case as unique. It's trying to put it into one of the categories it was programmed to do. So it takes away that. So the reality is technology reliance is dehumanizing. We also have a problem of tech dependency. Like, let's be honest. If you use it too much, you can't function without it, and that is a problem. I ask any of you, of my students, if you regularly scroll TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, whatever, I ask you to think about how often you check your phone and how often you use your phone. And then I urge you to try and go a day without it. You'll find that it becomes difficult. I understand that. I have a similar problem, and that's something to do with dependency. When we use it too much, we depend on it. We need it. And we are no longer able to function without it. And that is a problem, especially if there's an issue with the technology or it goes down. And then last but certainly not least is a lack of transparency, which we've already talked about in the last one, which is what exactly do we know? Does anyone know how it's used? I also ask many of my students always, do you know how your phone works? And I don't mean like how to access the apps. Like, do you know the science behind your phone and the programming that went into it and the development of the microchips and everything? And most people say no. Obviously, there are a few people that do. And those of you, I'm impressed. But the reality is most of us don't know. And that is a scary thought. So, we have questions. So how do we deal with this? How do we deal with these issues of privacy, transparency, etc.? And so, honestly, the big one with transparency is regulation or oversight. And I know some people want less government oversight, but there's a reason oversight exists. We want regulation, we want safeguards, we want transparency, but we also, and this is important, I've said it before, education. People need to be educated on what these things are and how they're used. We also should have safeguards put in place, and something that is not always there but should be is human oversight. Human oversight should be the first and primary thing when it comes to any of these decisions. Regardless of algorithm, regardless of cost, it should always be human first. So, I come back to my two questions, one that I asked earlier already, which was, is it ethical to electronically monitor juveniles? But now, my second question for all of you is related back to the comment about VR and how I said, education should be more engaging. When did you lose your love for education or school, if you did? Now, obviously, I'm not asking you to answer these questions and send them to me, but I want you to think about those questions. So number one, I'll tell you that first one, is it ethical to electronically monitor juveniles, is a quiz question. The second one is just for fun. But I want you to think about those because neither one of them has a direct answer. They're personal. They're related to you. And that's kind of the point. And if I haven't said this already, there's a reason all of my quizzes and exams are open notes and why a majority are essay questions. Most essay questions do not have a single right answer. If they don't have a single right answer, it means it's your chance to engage with the material and learn. It's interacting with the content. I'm giving you a question to guide you, but I'm asking you to think about all the things that we've talked about, and I'm asking for you to think about how you would respond. On that note, that's the end of Lecture 7. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining me on this one. We have just one lecture left, which will be next week, week 8. And at that time, there will also be a final exam. Final exam will cover everything from Chapter 5 through 8. So it'll be everything from the midterm on. So nothing from the first half. That being said, the rest of this week is a quiz and work on your proposal project, which is due next week as well. But thank you very much, and I will see you in the next video.